Welcome back to the third and final key concept in topic 5. In this topic we're going to be looking at a critical practice theory. This presentation builds on the idea that education is informed by a range of theories. In the last topic you heard about some of these. There are many more. What I hope you are gleaning from the topic so far is that theories of education are as old as mankind and that these have been formed, reformed and transformed across millennia. The theory of practice architectures has evolved from a rich and complex tradition. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but first of all we'll come back to this definition, and I'd like you to make sure that you've got that in your mind as we move forward, because it's actually this definition that we're going to be unpacking through the lens of the theory of practice architectures. As I said before, the theory of practice architectures has evolved from a rich and complex tradition. This slide lists some, and again not all, of the antecedents of the theory. The diagram profiles a broad church of practice theories and philosophies. You'll recognise some that we've already talked about, Aristotle in there, some that you will already know from other studies, Karl Marx, Lev Vygotsky's there, but the ones that we'll be particularly talking about, and in this context, are Habermas, Honneth, Schatzky, with residual practice traditions or traditions seeping through from the other theorists. So, this table provides an overview of how practices are viewed from different research traditions or paradigms. It's interesting, we talked about some of those paradigms that saw the learner as objective or subjective, as the site of the individual, looking at the individual psychologically, the behaviourist theories, and the constructivists looking at more social aspects of the learner and education. So if we look at some theories look at perspective 1, 2, 3, 4, or combinations of them. The importance of this diagram is that perspective 5 sees practices as socially and historically constituted and reconstituted by human agency and social action. So these are the critical theories and the critical practice theories that we identified earlier. This aerial view, if you like, that takes in the reflexive and the dialectical, diffuses dichotomies between the individual and social and the objective and subjective, and views practices as being related and mutually constituted. From this perspective, then, as we've said, they are socially and historically constituted and reconstituted through the human agency and social action. So this symbol, the infinity symbol, represents the backbone of the theory of practice architectures. Changing practices, according to this theory, can only be achieved when the arrangements holding the practices in place are transformed so that practitioners encounter each other in new ways in spaces. For example, supporting a transformation such as the rollout of a new curriculum document might typically focus on providing professional development for the educators implementing the curriculum. Through this PD, the educators might learn new sayings and doings and even relatings. However, what is largely absent is attention to the arrangements shaping the practices possible within particular sites, so changing the arrangements or the conditions enabling and constraining the practices. If these are not attended to, typically, so considering if the material economic arrangements aren't adjusted, or the setups or resources the infrastructures aren't put in place to support the curriculum change, then quite often practices remain pretty much the same as they were before. So what do we mean when we use the word practice? I hope this is becoming familiar to you now. Practices are socially established, cooperative human activity involving sayings, doings, and relatings, and that they hang together in a distinctive project. So the project encompasses the intention or the aim that motivates the practice, the actions, the interconnected sayings, doings and relatings undertaken to conduct the practice, and the ends or the aims the actors want to achieve through the practice. So if we're looking at education, according to Kemmis et al., the project of education is the good of the individual, living well, and the good for humankind, living well in a world worth living in. The sayings, doings and relatings that compose practices do not exist in a vacuum. They're made possible and they're enabled and constrained by material economic arrangements. The doings are held in place by material economic arrangements. The relatings are held in place by social political arrangements, and the sayings are held in place by cultural discursive arrangements. And let's just break those terms down a little bit. By material, we mean the physical setups. By economic, we're thinking about what kinds of arrangements are enabled and constrained by access to things like money. And in the social and political arrangements, social is thinking about solidarity, power, and according to Habermas, it's the life world of the practice, where it happens and how it unfolds. And the political elements are looking at things like power and systems. In the cultural discursive arrangements, cultural is what we've come to expect as normal, or the norms and the expectations. And by discursive, if you think about the word discussion, it's about words, what words and ideas are holding the practices and the sayings of the practices together. Collectively, these arrangements are called practice architectures. Practice architectures can also be understood in terms of practice traditions. The traditions carry with them the imprints of prior sayings, doings, and ways of relating enacted in a particular practice. So they encapsulate the history of the happeningness of the practice and act as a kind of collective memory of the practice. Practice traditions are invoked in a workplace or a site when people refer to the way we do things around here. Returning to that infinity symbol, the backbone of the theory of practice architectures as applied to education looks at the individual on one side and the site on the other, or the collective. So that's where that aim starts to talk about the individual and the collective. So we're looking at the practitioner and the practices and the site of the practices, where the practices take place. And that infinity symbol reminds us that these are mutually constituted, that they happen in a constant way. They're not sort of structured or siloed. Okay, let's look at an example. So, starting at the left side of this image, the individual, we can observe the language and ideas of particular education practices. And I've given an example here, homework. So next we can think about some doings of the practice of education we call homework. It might be that the activities are on a computer, that it's a computer-based activity. Then we can consider the practices, what kind of relatings are happening here at the practitioner level. What sorts of relationships is that practice of homework, of doing homework, showing us? What can we see around those relationships? So there might be different relationships between the parents and the carer. It may be that the activity of doing homework, the practice of doing homework, is a really warm and fuzzy thing that happens in the home or with the family after school. It may be that it's not a warm and fuzzy thing, that it's a really busy time of the day, and it's really a difficult thing to be happening. What sort of relationships if you've got multiple siblings in the house trying to compete at the same time for attention around help with their homework? So you can see that practice homework has got mutually constituted sayings, doings and relatings that unfold as the practice happens. On the side of the social, we're encouraged to think about the arrangements that are holding that practice of education, homework, in place. So what's enabling and constraining the practices? What are the cultural norms or expectations? Who tells us that doing homework is a good thing, is something that we should do? Where did that norm or expectation come from? You might have to do some research to find out about that. Where did the language of homework come from? What words or ideas? What's the idea of homework? Is it to reinforce learning that took place in the day? Is it for children to finish a work that they didn't get time to do during the day, so therefore it might not be seen as an extension of learning rather than a completion of learning? Where did that come from? They're the cultural discursive arrangements, those words and ideas around homework. And encourage you to think, are they logical, just, or untoward? Is homework a thing of another century that busy parents and children and families don't have time for now? So looking then at the material economic arrangements that are associated with this practice, this educational practice, doing homework, we need to think about the physical setup of the site where it takes place. Is it happening at home? Is it happening in after-school care? Because if it is, then it's going to have a different dynamic. What's possible? What's enabled and constrained there? Also, there is economic things to think about. So do all children, if the expectation is of doing computer activity, do all children have the adequate resources and time, if you like, the physical things to achieve that well? Do they have a laptop or access to a computer and internet? And again, you're encouraged to think about, are these arrangements or conditions logical, just, or are they untoward? Looking at the social and political arrangements that go around the relatings associated with doing homework, what's the impact on others and the world? Is it good to have children, doing homework? It's an individualised task on a computer. Potentially they may need some help, but potentially it could actually place them in their bedroom alone on a computer, and that may not be the best place for them to be. Maybe they'd be better outside. Their homework might be to do 30 minutes physical activity. I'm not making judgments, I'm just prompting thoughts here. If we're using energy sources like computers and things like that, are there issues around the world at large that we're thinking about around sustainability, in terms of the political arrangements or conditions putting in there? Are there children who will have more access and privilege to resources through that particular activity? And are there children being left behind because they may not be able to access a computer after school? So that trying to just sort of see how they're mutually constituted. This relatively simple process of a practice, doing homework, has got quite complex implications. So when we go back to that definition, we said that education is an initiation into forms of understanding, modes of action, ways of relating to one another in the world. So on the side of the individual, it's education for living well. On the side of society, education is fostering self-expression to secure a culture based on reason, self-development to secure a productive and sustainable economy and environment, and self-determination to secure a just and democratic society. So on the side of the social, the collective, education for a world worth living in. Now, the tricky bit, you're going to look at practices just as I have done there with homework, and you're going to complete your immersion report. Your practices might be more complex, they could be quite simple, but you can see that for every practice, there's going to be some conditions, some arrangements, some architectures holding them in place. And that's what I want you to report on. You may have to decide, prioritise practices, because you'll see way too many to report on. Okay, that brings us to the end of Module 1. In the next module, Module 2, we're going to be looking at the concept of being an educator. So we're going to look through the lens of this theory at some of the really important things that we need to know, do, and be as educators.